Welcome, Yuval. Welcome to the lockdown, but very much still happening FTWeekend Festival. Thank you for joining us from semi-lockdown Tel Aviv.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
What I'd like to do, though, now is take the Yuvalian long view. In the context of the millennia of history, how do you think this year will be seen?
Oh, well, I'm not sure it will be remembered. You know, when you're in the midst of a historical event, you're usually convinced this is the most important thing that ever happened. But then after a few decades, not just a few millennia, after a few decades, people hardly remember it. And we've seen it with previous epidemics. Epidemics in general tend to leave a much smaller imprint on history than people assume. If you think about the big influenza epidemic of 1918, for example, it had a far smaller impact than the First World War, even though it killed more people. If you think about art, just compare the number of books and poems and TV series about the First World War to the basically non-existent crop of poems and books and TV series about the influenza. Now, this may be changing now because the nature of pandemics is changing. Throughout most of history, pandemics were seen as natural disasters beyond the control of humans. So they were, in this sense, less interesting. Now, because of our scientific capabilities, pandemics have become a political disaster or a political failure. If there is a pandemic, it's no longer a natural disaster, it's a political failure. And therefore, they are also becoming much more interesting because politics is always more interesting to people than natural disasters.
Even if it is ostensibly a blip, could it be, though, that it does have an extraordinary effect on some of the sort of subtler debates going on, for example, between autocracy and democracy, that this is one of those sort of hinge moments where one or other systems of government is shown to have the upper hand?
Yeah, it does have an effect on many things, from the process of digitalization that has been hugely accelerating over the last year to these political debates, whether it's between autocracies and democracies or about the EU or it's about the US federal government. I think the jury is still out what the long-term meaning of the epidemic will be for these political issues. It's not very clear whether the conclusion is that autocracies work better or democracies work better. There is a lot of evidence for both sides. And you know, the battle over the narrative is still going on.
The history of this has not been, the history of great global government has not been wildly successful. You think of the League of Nations, you think of the United Nations, which is a bit of a bystander at the moment, frankly. Yeah. What gives you ground to believe this is any more than a pipe dream?
You know, on one level, it is a dream. It's not a reality. It's not like we have a functioning global cooperation on COVID or on climate change, on the rise of AI or anything else. My view, it's not, I don't predict that it will happen. I just say if it doesn't happen, I don't see how humanity can deal with these kinds of threats. So maybe we don't. Maybe we are unable to deal with climate change. Maybe we are unable as a species to deal with the rise of AI, and that is just it. So I hope we'll become more cooperative. And in a sense, it's not just a pipe dream, because you do see that global cooperation in the early 21st century is much more efficient than in any previous time in history. It's far from perfect. And of course, I mean, it's not even clear what perfect is. I don't believe in a single global government all over the world. I think it's a bad idea. It's not only won't work, it's really a bad idea. We need better cooperation between nation states. That's the essential thing. I think that the key message is not that we need to replace nation states with a global government. No, we need nation states working together on their common interests, because there is no contradiction between advancing national interests and cooperating with other countries. You know, some politicians have this message that nationalism and globalism are contradictory and that you have to choose nationalism and reject globalism. But my view is that this is simply a fundamental error. There is no contradiction there. In many cases, like in fighting a pandemic, in order to better advance your own national interests, you need to cooperate better with other nations. And we do have better global cooperation than in any previous time in history. And if you just look at the pandemic, the level of cooperation between scientists and health institutions and universities during this pandemic was really remarkable. Many of the key insights, the key studies were done by an international team of scientists. Many of the key inventions, like the development of vaccines, was done not in one country, but through cooperation of many countries. So I think we need to kind of have more realistic expectations of what global cooperation means, and then we can see it all around us.
Yeah, so the very early draft of history would be, it was the year of the scientist and definitely not the year of the politician, I think.
Yeah, I mean, at least in 2020, you saw amazing success of scientific cooperation and a failure of political cooperation, and not even on the level of the entire globe, even on the level of single countries. You saw, like in the United States, the failure of the federal government to come up with a single plan for the whole United States. Now, this doesn't mean that federalism doesn't work and that we need to dissolve the US into 50 independent nation states. It means we need to try harder.
Let's turn from globalism to another ism, an ism that is very close to the FT reader's heart. Capitalism. I sense from reading your books that, well, one, you make very clear that obviously the capitalism won over communism, but I don't think you're a sort of total believer in the longevity, in the future longevity of capitalism. Do you think capitalism will endure, or is that just going to be one of these things that has its moment and then disappears?
It's a question of time scale. If you ask me in terms of years and maybe even decades, it will endure. You don't see any serious competition at the present. But if you think in terms of generations and centuries, then something else will come along, because capitalism is not part of the laws of nature. It's not like physics or chemistry. It's really just a story that people came up with about how the world works and how the world should work. Things like corporations and corporate law and money and banks and all this, these are our creations. They exist only in our own imagination. They are not objective entities or objective laws of nature. And they couldn't even exist in many previous eras, in many previous civilizations, because you didn't have the necessary cultural foundations to believe in such things. So at the present moment, we created a world which is conducive to these capitalist institutions and stories and mythologies, and it works better than all the alternatives. But things change. And, one of the hallmarks of capitalism, or at least free market capitalism, which is the dominant version of capitalism, is that centralized control of the economy doesn't work. And one of the main reasons that centralized control of the economy indeed failed to work in the 20th century is because people or institutions lack the capacity to process all the information in one place. If you wanted to manage the entire Soviet economy in Moscow, it meant you needed to bring enormous amount of information to one place, process it there, and make all the decisions there and send the commands, the orders everywhere.
Yeah.
And you just couldn't do it with 20th century technology. It was inefficient. Dispersing the information and dispersing the power to make decisions between many players was more efficient. But this is, again, it's not a law of nature that it's always like that. It's only under 20th century technological conditions. Now, the rise, especially of artificial intelligence and big data algorithms, may change that. Maybe we are entering an era in which it is possible to concentrate and process all the information in one place, that actually it has an advantage over spreading it between many different players. And then a central command economy might become more efficient than a free market capitalist economy. And it's not a prophecy, it's just a possibility that we need to take into account.
And better for the individual.
For the individual, I don't know. But maybe it's just, even capitalism, it's not that it works better for the individual in every case, it just outcompetes the other systems. So we could enter an era in which, no matter what is the impact on the individual, in the competition between systems, the centralized system is more efficient. It works better.
You've inspired me to plan a big debate about capitalism amongst our readers, because I think that some of them will be appalled to hear that it's not a natural part of the natural order of things.
Through most of history, when you look at most ancient civilizations and cultures, they did not function in a capitalist way. So, I mean, you can argue, maybe you can imagine that capitalism was always the natural way to do things, and it was kind of stopped by all these religious and cultural and political institutions that until finally in the modern age, it was liberated from all these impediments and the natural thing could finally run its course. But it's very, as a historian, I find it very unconvincing to think that for most of human history, something unnatural was happening. And finally, in the last 2-3 centuries, somehow the natural laws manifested themselves. I mean, you just need to think that, like any economy, capitalism works on trust. And what makes capitalism really unique and successful is its ability to generate enormous trust between complete strangers. Without trust, there are no markets. Without trust, there is no credit, there is no money. Money is actually just trust. If you ask what money is, I mean, money can be anything. It can be paper, it can be gold, it can be electronic bits on your computer. If we have a contract and I break the contract and you take me to court, it's a free market, so I pay the judge to rule in my favor. In such a system, of course, capitalism collapses. It needs at least something that doesn't work on free market principle, that the judge won't rule in favor of the person that pays the highest bribe.
On the subject of trust, you wrote very powerfully a year ago, and you returned to this actually a week or so ago, about the issue of whether we should trust other people to hold our data. And this all goes to the heart of the debate over surveillance. Most people, when it comes down to it, if they're given a choice of something that makes them healthier and live longer, or not having that, but retaining their privacy, they would opt for health over privacy. Yes. You, I think, are less certain about that. And I wonder if you could explain why that is.
Well, I think that, if you give people the choice between health and privacy, they will almost always choose health. The problem is that we just don't need to give them this kind of choice. It's a false way of presenting the dilemma. Why should we have to choose between health and privacy? Ideally, we should be able to get both. I mean, this is a situation already today, that when I go to my personal physician, she knows a lot of very, very private things about me, and that's fine because she doesn't share this private data with all kinds of, I don't know, corporations and political parties and the government or whatnot. She's using this data to help protect my health and potentially the health of other people. So I think the key thing is just not to present it to the public as a kind of either or choice that you have to choose. You want health? Okay, so give up your privacy. It shouldn't be like that. In the last FT piece I wrote, I suggested like these 3 basic rules for how can we have, we can have surveillance. We need surveillance to fight epidemics. We need big data and algorithms and AI to have better healthcare. But how can we have them and still protect our privacy and our democratic values? And there are ways to do it. One principle is that whenever you collect data on people, the data is used to help the people and not to control or manipulate them or to benefit third parties. I mean, it sounds simple, but in many cases today it's not done. The data collected is used for the benefit of somebody else. The second principle is that whenever you increase surveillance from top to bottom, you must balance it by increasing surveillance from bottom upwards. Well, okay, the government needs to monitor me more to prevent epidemics, that's fine, on condition that simultaneously new systems are created to monitor what the government is doing. Like in this crisis, governments are spending enormous amounts of money. Like we just heard about the $1.7 trillion package passed in the US. So we need better systems that make it very easy for citizens, for individuals to see who is getting the money, who is making the decisions. And this creates a balance. So, okay, they know more about me, I know more about them. And the third principle is that never to allow too much data to be concentrated in just one place, whether it's a government or a corporation, because this is really the high road to totalitarianism. We are now at a point in history that if you have enough data and computing power, you can basically hack human beings and know them better than they know themselves. So to prevent this, we need to prevent the over-concentration of data. And again, it doesn't matter if it's concentrated in the hands of a government or of a corporation. Both are equally dangerous.
Yes, you wrote rather wonderfully, almost sort of in conclusion to that sort of passage. You wrote, if you want to prevent a digital dictatorship, keep things at least a little inefficient. Yeah. I thought that was rather splendid.
Inefficiency in many systems in life, a little inefficiency is a good thing.
Should we say biochemical algorithms are being superseded by electronic algorithms? Mm-hmm. Namely, in layman's talk, the age of the robots is upon us, and humanity is going to have to sort of take second place. Is it possible, though, that we are overly gloomy about this, and that in just the same way that you chart in your first book that millions of years ago, Homo sapiens found fire and learned to master it and didn't burn out in the flames, mm-hmm. in the same way that we can now learn to master this and Homo sapiens needn't die out?
Yeah, I mean, there are many scenarios. Nobody knows for sure. The big difference is that this time we are creating something that masters us. That's the first time it's happening. I mean, fire never understood us. Tools, knives, wheels, steam engines, none of these things hacked human beings, understood human beings, or could replace human decision-making. You always had the human at the center, the human brain, the human mind at the center making the decisions. And all the inventions just gave more power to the human making the decisions. What's different now is that you're creating something that makes the decisions instead of me, perhaps even better than me. Now, there is a vision that it will be a synergy, that I will increasingly make decisions together with the computer, together with the algorithm. So it's not the replacement of humans by algorithms. It's kind of the merger of humans with algorithms. And it is, there is such a potential, but we don't know for sure. I mean, if you think again about something like the financial system, if you think how many people understand the financial system today, I think it's fair to say that it's less than 1% of people on the planet understand how the financial system works. Now imagine a scenario that in 20 years or 30 years, the number is 0. The financial system is becoming so complicated, so fast, because it's increasingly more and more decisions are being made by algorithms. And the thing is that this is something that people often miss. Algorithms make decisions in a fundamentally different way than humans. And therefore, there is some kind of an unbridgeable gap there. Like to take, let's say, a simple decision. I apply to the bank and I ask for a loan. Previously, you had a human being go over my data and make the decision. And usually humans make decisions on the basis of 2, 3, 4 salient data points. So think about it politically. What happens when you still have a human prime minister, because it's important for humans to feel safe that they are being managed, governed by human beings, not by some robots. But all the crucial financial decisions are taken by algorithms just because nobody can understand it.
One more thing on the future. Again, you write at one stage about, I guess, the biggest thing of all for humanity, death. You say death is a technical problem, and every technical problem has a solution, which seems to suggest that given all you've thought about the last few million years, that ultimately we will be able to conquer death.
Potentially. I mean, it's not a metaphysical rule coming from God that people have to die. It's a biological process. If you understand this process well enough, you can manipulate it, prevent it, stop it. I mean, for a very long time in evolution, organisms didn't die. I'm not absolutely sure about it, but I think that at least some microorganisms, they don't necessarily die. It's mostly multicellular organisms like ourselves that die. So it's not like it's a built-in feature of any life form that it must die, or what death even means. And if you think about digital life forms, it's not so clear what life and death would mean for a digital life form if such a life form can be created. Personally, I don't think we will see it in our lifetime. Maybe if you're a baby born today to a billionaire, you have a chance of living indefinitely, maybe. But I think for me and you, it's too late. I mean, it's not moving fast enough that we will be able to prolong life indefinitely. And I'm not even sure it's a good thing. It can be extremely worrying and creating immense anxiety.
Of course, may all really be preempted by the fact that it's perfectly possible we'll have blown up the planet long before anyone can have learned how to defeat death. And you write about this. You say, way back in the day, as it were, humans had no more impact on the environment than gorillas, fireflies, and jellyfish. That, of course, is not the case today. We have colossal impact on the planet. The other week, just before your latest essay for the FT, Bill Gates wrote a piece for the Weekend FT, in which he optimistically argued that we will innovate our way through the climate crisis, that the world won't be destroyed by climate change because humanity will innovate and will find the technology to defeat it. What's your take on that?
So the big question is, who are we? Some humans will survive climate change, but billions of humans might suffer tremendously or die because of it. So, you know, there is no single future to all humans. And that's especially true of things like COVID, of things like climate change. So some humans will survive, but billions of humans might not. And that should be a very big concern for everybody.
I want to ask you one more question, Yuval. It's about happiness. You write in your books that historians too often don't consider the issue of happiness when they're writing history. Well, one of the things about this last year is everyone's had a lot of time, or some people have had quite a lot of time to think about their lives and how they live them. You, I think I'm right in saying, you go on a 1-month retreat every year and you go offline. I just wonder if you'd learned anything from those retreats about happiness.
I think a lot, otherwise I wouldn't do it every year. I think that one thing is that it's good to go offline every now and then. That there is a lot of talk these days, you know, about breaking the chain of infections, but we also need to break the chain of infectious thoughts, that we are flooded by enormous amounts of information and opinions and thoughts and worries and so forth. And we need to give our mind a break every now and then, again, not all the time, but every now and then, to give the mind a break, to be able to start afresh, to be able to disconnect from this flood of news and information and thought. Otherwise, we get caught up in it, and it spirals out of our control. What is very obvious to me is that we almost never experience the world as it is. We almost always have this something in front of our eyes, a cover, a curtain, which is produced by our own minds. It's the stories that our own mind produces and believes. And we go through lives without really seeing the world, just seeing this curtain and the projections of our own mind. And it's very important to give the mind a break every now and then and be able to kind of detoxify and be able to let go of all these stories and fantasies that we are creating. It's good for our personal well-being, but it's also extremely important for the well-being of society and of the world as a whole.
Well, I think we could all sign up to that. And now there's a one-word answer that I want from you now, Yuval, and thank you so much. What are you most looking forward to doing when all the lockdown is over? What have you missed most?
What have I missed most? And going back to teach my students at university face-to-face and not online via Zoom.
Well, I know my student sons would be delighted to hear you say that. Thank you so much, Yuval. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for those mind-expanding thoughts. And thank you on behalf of all the readers of the Weekend FT.
Thank you.